here we are with another one of these book things. I don't know what to say about them. They get, about as much view as my game playthroughs, which to me are sort of the major part of the gaming experience rather than the review. And certainly me reading the rules is of no interest whatsoever, I would think. But I mean, I'm sure people don't actually listen to that part. This one is The Boleyn Inheritance by Philippa Gregory. I read The Other Boleyn Girl, which apparently a movie was made of too, which focused on the Anne Boleyn story from her sister Mary, who was Henry's mistress before Anne Boleyn came back and became such. I don't remember it too much except that I enjoyed reading it. And in particular, I don't remember whether Jane Boleyn, who was the wife of Anne and Mary's brother George, was particularly represented in it. I also don't remember. I think it was all from the point of view of Mary, but maybe not. It may have swung around a bit. In particular, in that book, I feel like the question of whether or not George and Anne actually were having sex was left kind of up in the air. It was definitely something that was being considered as a way to get an heir when Henry, was no longer able to or whatever. And that's all fitted into what historically are considered to be trumped up charges largely against Anne Boleyn. But anyway, getting aside from that, this takes an interesting pair of queens, Anne of Cleves, who was briefly queen, and essentially Henry put her off. My understanding of what sort of the received information is that he and Anne remained friendly throughout. It doesn't really come across in here. Henry is portrayed as a very, very ugly creature. Not just physically, he's around 50 at this point. This is the fat Henry that you're used to seeing, but it's also the Henry who has, an unhealing leg wound that reeks, and he's farting all the time. Apparently he had serious constipation issues and whatnot. Just all kind of problems. But Anne of Cleves was chosen for political reasons, to have a Protestant German prince connected in case the Catholic League could move against England. In particular, the idea of a Franco-Spanish alliance against England was very, very frightening. But it doesn't really help because the emperor is Catholic and Habsburg, and I'm really not sure how valuable this is as an alliance feature. But again, my knowledge of that period, as with any, is less than maybe it should be. And there appears to be a significant amount of effort done on obtaining as much of the historical background and remaining true to it as possible. Now, like the Guns of the South thing by Turtledove that I did recently, the characters are handled in ways that maybe they're not quite, the thing is, no one can really know when you're doing some sort of historical fiction or something, no one can really know what these people are like, and if you're starting to enter into their minds and everything, as opposed to in a biography, where you can kind of fall for your subject matter, but also you end up trying to stick to just the facts. In something like this, the author is trying to project what are sort of modern sensibilities back into, a modern background and whatnot that she has, back into that period to try to catch the thinking of the characters and whatnot. And I think she does a fair job at it. I mean, there's no way to really judge, but it feels appropriate in a lot of cases. Maybe not so much in some. It's hard to tell. But she's woven characters that feel believable in their time and place, and also richly developed in ways that, try to maybe explain some of their actions and how they are. So, like I said, Anne of Cleves is one of the two queens covered in this one. The other one's Catherine Howard, who, after Anne was set aside, and because of Catherine Howard, in part, Anne was set aside. Like, basically, same kind of situation with Jane Seymour. Henry takes a fancy on a new young little thing, and decides there are other reasons in play as well. So historically, Anne of Cleves has been projected as being particularly ugly. She doesn't appear to be, and her portrait was sent to Henry beforehand, and he approved. So, the argument there is that, when he first meets her, he comes in disguise, which is something that he liked to play at. And this is an actual event. And, she doesn't know who he is and is just disgusted by him. and that in his twisted viewpoint kind of is the real underlying cause of why he can't accept her and whatnot. Catherine, I found actually the most interesting of the characters. The book is told from 3 points of view, 3 different characters, Anne and Catherine, and then also Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn, who, again, would have featured in the earlier book. I don't remember her showing up much, as George Boleyn's wife, who gave testimony against both him and Anne Boleyn. Anyway, so it's done from those 3 point of views, pretty much cycling, one after the other. There may be a couple of disruptions in there, but it's pretty much you're touching each one at each time. It feels a little weird to have Anne of Cleves in there towards the end of the book, because she doesn't really know anything. She doesn't have her fingers in any of the pies or anything. She's the disinterested viewer from afar, for the most part, for the back half of the book. But she is the main character in a sense. Well, she is the queen coming in and whatnot, and it just feels like she kind of becomes she can't be utilized, essentially, for the back half of the book. And then, you get her take on things. Now, out of the characters, Anne of Cleves is presented as just too good. Not unbelievably so, as a clever woman, which actually she probably very much was, although she's accused of being fat and stupid by Henry. Uh, the truth of the matter is to have maintained his interest in the kind of friendship that that historically seems to be there doesn't really come across in this book at all. And probably was a clever conversationalist and whatnot. And she does, like, one of the arguments about why she's not, particularly clever and whatnot seeming is because she doesn't know English, she doesn't know French, she knows German, and I think, I don't know if she knows Latin, but she doesn't know any of the languages that were common at all in the court. Obviously, French and English would be Spanish, maybe a little bit still. And she was brought up, as a Lutheran, and probably in a much less grandiose type of court, as a Lutheran duke's daughter, Duke, Duchy of Cleves. And probably a very much stricter type of upbringing, which is represented in the book. But again, that's projection. Like I said, the author does try to work any historical knowledge into these, but you have to go off the rails to give, a full kind of description inside the mind of the characters and whatnot. You really have to go beyond this. I felt like this did a much, much better job than like trying to get into Lee's mind in the Turtle Dove book. And I don't really remember the other Boleyn girl, but I don't remember I remember enjoying it. So I think any kind of, discord between what the character and the time period and whatnot play out would have hindered that to some extent. So, like I said, Anne comes across a little too good, a little too clever, although not in a scheming sort of way. Just kind of bland in a lot of ways, which might kind of fit. The other two characters are very, very interesting, though. Catherine is, you first see her at like 14 at her step grandmother's house, or manor or whatever, and she's already being portrayed as this slut, basically. But that's the upbringing in that house that's being projected. How true is it? It's hard to tell. But also kind of conniving, but not very clever in a lot of ways. She likes the finer things in life, very much a gold digger type in that sort of way. However, I found her the most attractive because she's coming at this as just this young girl with lusts and desires to have fine things and seems to just want to have fun. And she's 14 at the time, okay, to begin with. She marries Henry at 15. She's dead by 17. This whole feeling that the author is kind of trying to portray her as this frivolous and silly girl and whatnot. That sort of comes across, but it also comes across as very real in its own sort of way, and very pleasing in a lot of ways. So I actually found her quite charming in her descriptions, in her views and whatnot, and I don't know, it reminded me, not the kind of person I could ever deal with, but there were flashes of something that reminded me of people in my life. Which I would say neither of the other two characters did, right? There was none of that sort of little girl exuberance and charm and whatnot. uh, that, I mean, I'm going to say that I saw in most of the loves of my life was this sort of excitement and, uh, just a kind of pleasure that I can't have and hadn't seen in other people, and really charms me, even, you know, when it's taken in directions that are kind of not suitable for someone like me. The final character, though, Jane Boleyn, is also intriguing. She's operating as a schemer for the Howard family. She essentially protected the Boleyn inheritance, the Howard interests, through Anne Boleyn's reign. I don't think she was terribly influential in getting Anne Boleyn into power and whatnot. I feel like that was more Anne's doing herself, although, family connections and whatnot certainly provided additional power. But she did serve in the court. She actually had served in Catherine of Aragon's court, even as a young maid. And ends up, married off to George Boleyn as part of the prize, I guess, in its own way, that the Boleyns are getting. So she had to be some kind of a good match in some ways, because he didn't care for her at all. So anyway, and George had been one of the king's favorites as well. But historically, in the book, she starts out very troubled by this. She's sort of instrumental in giving some of the worst evidence against Anne and George. And this is against her husband and her sister-in-law. And you kind of get the feeling that it's true early in the book, and then that later on it becomes more questionable, and more seems to lean towards where the other Boleyn girl went, which is, yeah, this was maybe an idea that they had, but probably didn't go through with it. But again, it doesn't answer that question, which I really kind of like. I like that kind of, and part of it is because she's not fully sane. In fact, the historical record kind of sees her as insane at the end. That she broke under all the pressure. But both she and Catherine are kind of controlled by, he's both their uncles, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, who I think rose to greater power and whatnot with Anne Boleyn, but somehow manages to keep his hands in everything and stay an important lord, and continue directing features, and is basically machinating to make sure that Catherine, his niece, ends up, charming King Henry over. And then, and in this one, it's absolutely explicit, is encouraged by him and by Jane Boleyn to have an affair because the king's not getting her pregnant. affairs aren't getting her pregnant either. Anyway, um, she's very interesting as a character because you're so tied up. Like she's not a trustworthy narrator when she's in charge. I feel like the other two are in their own ways, whereas she's kind of her own thoughts aren't trustworthy is kind of the problem, and you run into that later on where she's doubting, exactly what she did and stuff like that, and then decides to play mad actually because that would prevent her from being executed. That's her attempt to defend because she is implicated this time very, very, she's instrumental in it. And, whether or not she actually was mad or is playing mad, here it's like she's playing mad but is mad. It's like, and it's just kind of an interesting character for you to look at it. I found the writing enjoyable. I found, again, the characters didn't feel like they were completely out of their place in time. Like, again, I fall back on the turtle dove. This was the Man of Marble Lee in that. And I mean that not from the book Man of Marble, but the Lee of the Lost Cause, who was whitewashed completely, and is just so good at everything, and doesn't like slavery even though he's a huge slaveholder, and just all kind of stuff that there's not really enough evidence for, and there's strong reasons in his historical record to not think of him as well, first of all, as all that great a general, but more importantly, in the context of that book, as someone having, these particular views that they hold out. One of the things always is like the myth of, I owe my loyalty to my state, before anything else, and family. A number of the members of his family went over to the Union. It's really a fuzzier thing. A number of members, the other Virginia colonels, for example, all pretty much stayed in the Union. I don't know if I think he may be the only one that actually went over to the Confederacy. So, there's a bunch of fuzz in there, and he's just portrayed as this honorable gentleman and everything in ways that, he had his slaves beaten and stuff. And anyway, I'm getting off into something else. In this book, though, I don't feel like anything really hit me that hard. Maybe the portrayal of Henry is a little too ugly. Is kind of my problem. And again, I feel like Anne of Cleves, she felt a little less interesting, I guess, is what I would put it. But not everybody is all that interesting inside, maybe. I don't know, Everybody I've been inside has been that interesting. And I mean, everybody I've been close enough to, I feel has a lot going on and a lot of conflicts and stuff. And it really doesn't feel like she does. Whereas I feel like there's interesting characters behind the other two narrators of the story. Anyway, I did enjoy it. I think I'm going to keep it primarily. See, I mean, there's always this problem, like with my games, but I just keep my games because whatever. But with books, I'm only going to read them alone. And each book that I put in here is saying, I might get back to this and read it again. And like, my inflow of books, I'm limiting it, but it's not that small. And I've got a large backlog, just like I do with the games. And I'm hoping I don't have a long life. So it's kind of like, why am I storing this? I don't know. But if I do have the other Boleyn girl still here, I kind of like the idea of reading them both together. She's written others too. She wrote one on Catherine of Aragon. And I know she was interested in writing one on, was it Catherine Parr? I think so. And there's clips on this about a book featuring Mary Queen of Scots. Talk about an interesting character to look at. I looked at her portrayal of that in the little snippets there. Kind of like, I don't know, maybe, maybe. It does, again, it's like she focuses in on how can I explain these kind of weird contradictions and stuff, and builds the character around that without going ahistorical, but looks for those contradictions. And that's, again, that's what Turtledove doesn't do, right? Turtledove doesn't look at Lee and say, how do I reconcile these contradictions? He just takes, that the man of marble and just puts him out there just, as the perfect guy that he is. Kind of like, I don't remember, starts with an F, last name starts with an F, the author that I read the Benedict Arnold historical fiction about, who just loves Arnold. But it's like, yeah, this is not what you want to do. You want to do this. You want to make these characters really, really interesting and spin something that may be just pure imagination and whatnot, but it ties together all those contradictions. And that's kind of the thing. I've got a lot of contradictions in my existence. Everybody I've known well tends to be complex in that sort of way. Mixtures of who they are, and it's not like they're just, and that again, that's the problem I have with Henry, is that, but you never really see inside him. You see him from the point of view of Anne, who's set aside by him, and of these two courtiers who, one of them marries him and is this foolish girl and whatever, and does not love him, but loves what he can do for her, and the other, who's this schemer, and they're both, everybody's just terrified of him, and that's kind of the thing, and the whole court's terrified of him. And given that you're not seeing inside him, but you're seeing the views that other people have of him, that's kind of fair. It's kind of fair. The characters that we actually see inside of, or enough of, are portrayed with a richness and a depth that I find very appealing. Anyway, I enjoyed, and I would definitely pick up other books of hers as well, because she writes well enough and does something really interesting in working the characters from historical aspects. Something that not a lot of people do, I guess.